Hi, folks. This is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D., for the Institute for Dialectical Meta-Realism. If you watched my podcast last night, you probably noticed that I suddenly ended it, and that was because my friend George was ringing my doorbell. I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast that I might have to end it very quickly because George was coming by, and he came by. Actually, he came by sooner than he said he would, which was nice. We had a chance to sit around and chat for a while. But I ultimately had to end the podcast. George, by the way, is a really nice guy. I really like him. He's an extraordinarily nice fellow. Very smart. Um, very smart in computers, but very smart in general. And I really like talking with him. Um, I don't know why I'm talking about him because it's unlikely that you will ever meet him. But but in any event, it was nice. It was nice hanging out with him for about an hour or so. Um, in any event, I wanted to pick up where I left off, um, and that is I was talking about Anarcho Syndical boy and his critique of a few people that I know and a couple of people that I don't think I do know. Um, the difficulty in my knowing whether I know certain people is because certain people use pseudonyms like Anarcho Syndical Boy. And so I don't know. Maybe I met them with a real name. Maybe I met them with another name. I don't know. So I can't be sure that, for example, that I never met comrade number three. I might have met comrade number three, but I don't recall having met him. In any way, if you were there, comrade number three, hi. I'd like to chat with you sometime. In any event, um, I wanted to continue with where I was last time. I said I was kind of wrapping up, but there are a few more things I wanted to add to what I said. First, to recap what I said yesterday, both Comrade Net and Jason Unruh are extraordinarily nice people. They have very high standards of morality. They are they have good character. They have nice dispositions, and so I would encourage you, uh, if you have never had a conversation with them in any medium. To be honest, if I had a conversation with Jason, actually no, only text, but I have had I have had phone conversations with Comrade Net, three of them. Um, and I suspect that eventually I'll have a phone conversation with Jason, but not yet. I've had conversations over via YouTube with Nicole, who's also mentioned in that video. She is also a very nice woman, a trans woman. I feel funny calling her a trans woman. I feel like I should just call her a woman because I think of her as a woman. But since she is active in the trans rights movement and she refers to herself as a trans woman, I call her a trans woman too, even though I would be just as happy to call her a woman. When I think of you, Nicole, I think of you as a woman. You are a woman to me, and a very nice one at that. And I'm happy that we are friends, that we met on YouTube, and that we have um, similar backgrounds as autistics. Although I'm not trans myself, I guess I'd be a trans woman since I'm, well, whatever. Uh, I'm not trans, but we're both autistics, and I'm not divulging anything that is secret because Nicole has said that herself in one of her podcasts. So we have that bit in common. I'll mention one other thing, which is it's a bit of an aside, but I think it's an important point that could be made here. I was having this conversation with my friend Sandy, and I won't mention her name, her last name here, obviously. Sandy will most likely see this podcast too. She watches most of my podcasts. Sandy thinks she may be autistic, and I agree that that is a possibility, although obviously I have no ability to diagnose her. I went through hell as a child, as an autistic. Sandy did not. I've been thinking recently about why some autistics, like me, and a few other people I know, had really, really lousy childhoods and were run through the ringer, if that's the right way to say it, and others were not. And I think I understand why that is. And I'm surprised it didn't occur to me earlier. When I was seeing Jim Hunter, who was the first adult psychiatrist I saw, because I had a roach infestation in my apartments in Kansas, and those roaches were crawling all over me and inside of me, if you get my point. Kind of disgusting, yes. And so I couldn't sleep. My primary physician said, well, all I can do is give you a mild sedative. And that wasn't enough. So he said, look, you need to see a psychiatrist. And I thought, oh my God, not again. Not after Charles Rabiner. My child psychiatrist, who was literally a monster to me, although as adults we got along fine. But I did not want to go through that. To my surprise, my first adult psychiatrist, now deceased, was an extremely nice guy. The adult psychiatrist that I have now, who I started seeing after Jim died, his name is Doug. And Doug is also an extraordinarily nice person. Very, very nice. He's a Buddhist, which is nice. Anybody who's a Buddhist has some focus on compassion or loving kindness, which is a good thing. And Doug is a very compassionate person. But what I realized is that the reason I think why I went through the psychiatric mess, for lack of a better term, whereas some autistics, like say my father, a diagnosed autistic like me, although late in life, did not, is because of the OCD. I remember a conversation I had with Jim, my first adult psychiatrist, and what he said is that when he meets autistics who also have OCD, he does not see those as separate conditions. He sees those as wrapped up in one another. So to him, there's no such thing as an autistic with OCD. There is a separate category of autistics who also have OCD, but it's a discrete category. Now, obviously, there are autistics who don't have OCD, like my father, and there are people who have OCD, but not autism, like my mother. So I inherited both of them. I got the worst from my father and the worst from my mother. Thank you very much. Obviously, I'm being sarcastic. Wasn't your fault, wasn't your fault. But regardless, I got it from them. So it appears to me that if Jim is right, that autistics with OCD is a separate category, all to its own, just like autism or the ASD, autism spectrum disorder, is a separate category, or maybe categories, and OCD is a separate category. Because generally speaking, the people I have known who were autistic, who went through the morass of psychiatry, that's all I can say it, as children. Now it's not quite as bad. Most psychiatrists I have met recently, some of whom are actually friends of mine, they're not my psychiatrists, but they're still friends of mine. They're really nice people. Psychiatry has gotten better. Psychiatrists have gotten better. And I'm really happy for all the people who are now diagnosed with both autism, ASD, and OCD combined, because I think they are more likely to get better treatment, or at least have the opportunity to get better treatment than I did, which isn't saying much because I got totally horrible treatment. Giving electric shock treatments to an 11-year-old child is worthless. You give electric shock treatments to adults with depression. I was not an adult, and I did not suffer with chronic depression. Was I depressed from time to time? Yes, but it was situational depression because of the fact that I was abused by other kids and later by my father. So I had no chronic depression. I should not have gotten ECTs, the technical term, electroconvulsive therapies. There was no reason why I should have gotten that. Now, I realize that this is a tangent from where I began, and I will return to that original subject in just a bit. But I just feel like I needed to qualify this to explain where I am coming from. And when I see Nicole is a really together woman. She, if I would encourage you to go to her channel and meet her on her channel. Her channel is called Red Pagan, one word, Network, a second word, and that's her YouTube channel. Go to her channel and watch her videos. She is an absolutely wonderful woman and a fascinating person to get to know. I am really happy that I got to know Nicole. But to the best of my knowledge, and I don't know this for sure, Nicole did not go through the runaround that I did. And again, I think that's because of the lack of OCD. So I think, again, autism with OCD is a distinct disorder, different from regular autism spectrum disorder and different from obsessive compulsive disorder. It is somehow a combination or a convergence of both autism and OCD, maybe when they finish up mapping the brain or figuring out which symptoms belong with which brain neurons, they will know exactly why that is. Because as of now, psychiatry is the only branch of medicine which operates on the basis of talk. You are diagnosed by having a conversation. You are not diagnosed through getting mental tests, physical tests, a urinalysis. There is no urinalysis for autism. Maybe there will be someday, or maybe there'll be other tests, but right now, no. And so I really think that my condition, the condition that I still have, because autism is not curable. I don't know if OCD is. but I know that I still have both. My OCD is very, very minimal. Occasionally it'll crop up, but very, very rarely. My autism spectrum disorder is still very much with me, but I know how to mask it. I've accommodated for it, and I know how to behave in a way so that I don't appear to be autistic. Am I being phony? No, it's all habit. I have simply developed new habit patterns, new ways of behaving. I remember standing in the bathroom, looking in the bathroom mirror, and watching how I behaved and being totally disgusted with myself when I saw how weird I looked. And then I could understand what, not to justify it, of course, but why other kids would abuse me. I mean, I looked like I was out of my mind. Now, was I out of my mind? Not really. I wasn't really out of my mind. I was certainly filled with a lot of problems, but I looked totally crazy. My eyes would spin around in circles. They would go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth, seemingly uncontrollably. Because I say that because I would try to stop it, and I couldn't stop it. Now I don't do that much. Do I do it occasionally? Yes. But as you are looking at me right now, I doubt that I am moving my eyes back and forth that much. 20, 30 years ago, that's exactly what I would be doing right now. I would have been noticeably weird. I am not noticeably weird anymore. I'm weird, but all autistics are weird to some extent. But I'm not noticeably weird. I mean, you wouldn't, if you saw me in a crowd, you wouldn't start staring at me. When I was a kid, if I was in a crowd, literally people would start staring at me. And that's no fun. At first, I couldn't understand why they were. I was thinking, what am I doing? I'm just walking down the street. It wasn't until I looked into the mirror and practiced talking that I realized why people were staring at me. I looked like a mess. I mean, I looked like I was intellectually disabled. I have a lot of compassion on people who are intellectually disabled, but I am not one of them. But I certainly looked like I was for somebody who didn't know. But that's the way a lot of autistics look when they're struggling with autism. It's a really, really difficult condition to have. So anyway, I got into this conversation because I was talking about Nicole and mentioning that Nicole does not appear to have gone through the same kinds of torment that I went through. She went through her own problems as a trans woman, but the kind of psychiatric morass with electric shock treatments and being on psychotropic drugs my entire childhood. I know a lot of people who have been through that. People I know right now. My best friend is someone who has been through that and is still struggling. I'm not going to get into specifics because he may end up watching this podcast, and I don't want to embarrass him. Obviously, nobody would know who he was, but still, it's awkward being, watching somebody talk about you. So I won't say who he is, but he's a person whom I love a great deal, whom I care for a great deal. He went through the the same kinds of childhood that I went through. But unfortunately, unlike me, he has not had the same amount of recovery as I have had. And that tortures me to no end. I wish that he did. I wish that he did. I don't know why I had it and he did not. All I can think of is I literally do not deserve it. And I'm not saying that to impress anybody with some phony humility or even genuine humility. I'm saying that because that's really how I feel. Like, I think Steve is a much nicer person than I am. Seriously. Not think Steve is a much nicer person than I am. He's a very gentle person. I'm not a bad guy, but I'm not as nice as he is. And yet he has suffered with this horrendous problem that appears to be getting worse, not better. Autistics seem to go in one of two directions as we become elderly. We either get worse or we get better. I started getting better when I was in my 20s. And when I had that maiden experience, which I've talked about before, which I don't expect anybody to believe, it's my experience, not anybody else's. But when she came to me and stood at the foot of my bed and gave me empathy or intersubjectivity, gave me a heart, which I never had before. All I can think of is all the autistics in the world. And I know many of them. Who don't have a heart. And that does not include anybody I've mentioned before, but I've known other autistics who do not have a heart. I have not mentioned them in this video. Although my father, to me, came pretty close, to be honest, when he would beat me up. I'll say that about him because he's deceased. If he were alive, I wouldn't say it, because we had actually worked things out toward the end of his life. When he died, my father and I were on very, very good terms. We loved each other, which is something that for some reason, he stopped loving me when I was a teenager. He loved me very deeply when I was a little kid, but as a teenager, he very clearly stopped loving me, which is something that till this day, I do not understand. And that is very, very traumatic for me at times. Okay, well, that was a really big diversion from the thing I wanted to discuss. So let me get back to it, talking about anarchism. And again, so I'm sorry for that tangent. But I like anarchism. I respect anarchists. I have known anarchists, including former students of mine. I should say, especially former students of mine who were anarchists. And especially this one guy who was a wonderful person who would stay after class sometimes for 3 hours and chat with me. Somebody chatting with me for 3 hours, that must be torture. Obviously, I'm joking, but he and I basically became friends. Although, you know, it's difficult being friends with your student when that person is your student. So you have to be somewhat careful of boundaries. But we still were friends. We still were friends. He knew it, and I knew it. he did not like Marxism. I told him, I said, look, I have nothing against anarchism at all. I said, in fact, I consider many anarchists to be my comrades, which I do till this day. I said, in fact, I called him by his name, I consider you to be my comrade because we have a lot of things that we believe in common and a lot of activism that we have engaged in that is similar. But the common anarchist view, which places governments ahead of capitalism, is one which I do not share. Now, I said common anarchist view. Why? Well, in Marxism, despite the fact that there is a tremendous amount of diversity among Marxists, many Marxist tendencies or currents, meaning like schools of thought, I guess you could say, or schisms or factions or any term you want to use like that, sects, although sect sounds like religion. And Marxism is definitely not a religion. But all Marxists can trace our work ultimately back to Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. That is not true with anarchism. There is no one person or persons to whom all anarchists, or let's say left anarchists, because that way it leaves out Murray Rothbard's right anarchism, which in the US is just commonly called anarchism. And most Americans think that's the only anarchism that exists, which is not true. In fact, left anarchism started about 100 years before Murray Rothbard's anarchism started. And left anarchism actually started in the 1850s, I think. I don't recall the name of the founder of it. And then pretty soon, similar libertarian currents were picked up within Marxism as well. And there are some anarchists who use elements of Marxist theory. There are some. There are some people who consider themselves to be hybrids of anarchism and Marxism. So anarchism is a difficult thing to make sense out of because it is so divided and there's no one person or persons that all anarchists can trace their ancestry back to. Like any Marxist would accept the Communist Manifesto or Capital or the Grundrisse or Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, and so on. Those are classical Marxist texts. Doesn't matter what kind of Marxist you are, you will accept those texts. There is no such thing in anarchism. Doesn't exist. Anarchism is a fusion of a variety of different positions that were created by different people with very different ideas, people who did not know each other, who were not generally influenced by one another. So there is no such thing really as anarchism. There really are anarchisms. Now, you can also say that there are Marxisms, but in a different way. Like, for example, I can say that Marxism, Leninism, and Council Communism are two different Marxisms. But despite that, both Marxism, Leninism, and Council Communism both trace their ancestry back to Marx and Engels. There is nothing like that in anarchism. It's a variety of currents, most left wing and one right wing. Again, that's the right anarchism, also called anarcho-capitalism, also called right libertarianism, a variety of names. So there really is no single anarchism that all anarchists can trace their ancestry back to. There is with Marxists. And so if I say that I have met a bunch of people who are anarchists and I have found some common ground, the logical question is, well, are you talking about an anarcho-primitivist? Are you talking about an anarcho-insurrectionist? Are you talking about an anarcho-feminist? In other words, there are so many different types of anarchism. I don't remember most of them. I would say probably at least a couple of hundred. And many of them literally are entirely unrelated to each other. So even if I have made common ground with a particular anarchist or a particular anarchist current or tendency, does not mean that I've made common ground with left anarchists. Because in reality, left anarchism is really just an arbitrary category, a human category that was made up and a bunch of different unrelated tendencies were placed into it. Whereas in Marxism, all the tendencies or currents come directly from Marx, but were interpreted in different ways by different people. And some of those tendencies and currents are arch enemies of one another, but they still trace their ancestry back to Marx and Engels. So I'm sorry you had to listen to all that if you did, anarcho-syndical boy. Maybe you didn't listen to all that, which is fine. But my reason for making this podcast is twofold. One, I wanted to express my humanness as an autistic. That I am a flawed man, flawed old man, 68 years old, I guess. I'm sure. Since you call yourself anarcho-syndical boy, I would assume that you are closer to being a boy than I am. But again, I don't know who you are. That's my assumption, but I could be wrong. Who knows? But I did that to show my vulnerability. I'm not a perfect person. I have lived a life filled not only with my struggles against capitalism, which it is, but a life filled with my struggles against autism, which it is. Fortunately, not as much as in the past, but it still is. And then to suggest to you the idea that there are differences between anarchism and Marxism, because they are both constructed differently. So people who say, well, I am both an anarchist and a Marxist, the first question is, which anarchism are you talking about? The second question is, which school or tendency or variant of Marxism are you talking about? Because all Marxisms ultimately, if you go back to the beginning, are connected with one another. That is not true with all anarchisms. That is what has, I think, been the major obstacle to bringing anarchists and Marxists together. The fact that there are so many different anarchisms, and the fact that there are different schools of Marxist theory, which are often quite hostile to one another. I mean, to be honest, I have been in a whole string of Marxist tendencies, and what that must do is place me in perpetual conflict with myself. And I realize I said that in a kind of jocular way, but it's true. I mean, I belong to a lot of Marxist tendencies which generally don't get along too well, and yet I've been in them, and I don't care, because what matters to me is who I am now, and I am willing to learn from the past. I don't have a negative view on who I was in the past. I just try to look at it in perspective, why I was in it, what I did in it, what, if anything, I accomplished in it, and where I want to go in the future. So I find it easy to do as a Marxist. I would imagine for an anarchist, it must be much more difficult to do that, since, again, there are so many different anarchisms, and many of them literally have absolutely no historical connection with one another. So when you talk about reconciling Marxism with anarchism, what are you talking about? That's the issue. So what I would suggest, again, which is kind of repeating what I said yesterday in a way, but maybe in a different fashion, is that your critiques of my friends Jason Unruh and Comrade Net, who I can assure you are both really, really good people. That your differences or difficulties with them are based not so much on what they believe in or what they say, but on the fact that there is such a discrepancy, a historical discrepancy between those two movements of the left, Marxism and anarchism. Marxism, which has a shared founder or founders, Marx and Engels. Anarchism, which does not. So I think that that's the problem. I know, for example, that the same kinds of problems that you were talking about in your letter or epistle, whatever you want to call it, are problems that have existed between different anarchists. How do I know that? Because I've read them. You go to the Anarchist Library website, I think it's anarchistlibrary.net, and you'll find it right there. You can actually read these things. These are out in the open. And why are they disagreeing with each other? Because they don't believe in the same things. The fact that they are all referred to as anarchism is simply, in my opinion, an act of convenience. But in reality, many of them have literally nothing in common. And so I know a bit about anarcho-syndicalism. I honestly know more about syndicalism in Marxism, which is very small. And there's also a form of syndicalism which broke away from that and which is fascist, unfortunately. But I know what syndicalism is. It's based on unions, and it's kind of like a super unionism, and I respect that. I like unions. I'm a lifetime member of the National Education Association, which I strongly love. I love it. I was a member of it during my entire career, so I decided I would pay the $450 to become a lifetime member. Is it getting me anything? No, but I feel at least I'm supporting my union. It's a union that I love. That's done a lot for me and for people in my field. So for me, that's payback. That's payback. So I like unions, but I'm not a syndicalist. And from your name, you are a syndicalist. Well, the people that you have been talking about are not syndicalists, Marxist or otherwise. They're not syndicalists. The left, like the right, in many respects, is very divided. I don't know which is more divided. I don't know if it really even matters. I guess you can try to count it. There's different schools in each, but who cares? They're both very divided. And I know what many of those divisions are. As a sociologist, I have studied them because one of my areas in sociology is social theory. So I'm interested in exploring these different schools of thought, these tendencies in both anarchism and in Marxism. And knowing that, I think that part of the difficulty that I saw in your epistle, and I can't say anything more than that because I don't. I watched Jason's video, but I mean, there was no real extensive elaboration on what you said in anything that I've read. I think that part of the problem that you are experiencing is that you are dealing with people who are neither anarchists nor syndicalists. That's not just one difference, that's two differences. And the more differences that people and tendencies have from one another, the more difficult it is to reconcile. Now, does that mean that people should not attempt to reconcile? Oh, of course not. We should always try to find ways to work with each other, especially now when the world is in such a horrendous state. Possibly the most dangerous time in human history. That may not be right. I'm old, but not that old, so I don't remember all of human history, but it's certainly a dangerous time. And since this is a dangerous time, there is, I think, a real, genuine need for people in all quarters of the left to set aside their disagreements. Just set them aside as much as possible. And I realize in many cases that can't be done. There's too much bad history. But where it can be done, to set them aside and to try to work with each other. Literally, to prevent our world from ending. That is a fear that I have on a daily basis, that we are close. I don't know how close, but I think potentially pretty close to literally destroying our planet. I mean, global warming, that will get worse and worse, but that'll be like 100 years from now before that totally decimates the earth. But there are a lot of other things, NBC, as it's usually called, nuclear, biological, and chemical weapons. If those types of weapons are deployed, we could literally see our planet wiped out like that. That would literally be the end of all of us. So what I'm saying is that I think it's important that we recognize our differences. Don't try to brush over them. It's good that you stated your differences. Fine. I must say I didn't understand everything you said, but maybe if I met you and talked with you, I'm sure you could clarify what you were saying to me over the phone or over Zoom or something. But whatever. I'm sure we could reach some level of understanding with each other. It's difficult doing that in writing sometimes. But I think that we really need to figure out some way of working together. And I would say, especially working together to empower the third world, to engage in what the Marxist educator Paulo Freire called conscientization, critical conscience, and consciousness raising, which he saw as the primary purpose of his critical pedagogy, his approach to teaching. He was a secondary school teacher. He wasn't a professor. He was a secondary school teacher. And a wonderful and brilliant man who inspired a lot of people, including me, and inspired my approach to teaching throughout my career, and has continued to inspire me as I make these podcasts, because literally the way I make these podcasts is virtually indistinguishable from the way I taught my classes, except maybe it's on a bit of a higher level. That's maybe the only difference. I'm not really, I realize I'm speaking mostly to people who know what I'm talking about, so I don't need to lower my level of conversation, which I did with my students, not to talk down to them, but just to avoid confusing them. Because if you're talking with people who have no knowledge of what you're discussing, you need to begin with A, not with Z, or as they say in Britain, Z. So you need to begin with A, not with Z or Z. So again, that's my request to you. I'm sorry I went on that tangent about autism, but I did that because I thought that I would share with you not only a bit about my own personal struggles as a communist, a Marxist, a Maoist third worldist, but my personal struggles as an autistic, which for me have been devastating. I would not wish them on anyone. So again, I hope that helps. I didn't feel like I was in a rush this time because George is not coming by to see me now, as far as I know. He will be coming by tomorrow sometime, but not today. But in any event, I think tomorrow, what day? Maybe not. Maybe not. He said he would come to see me when he figures out what's wrong with my computer. So it may not be tomorrow. I'm not sure why I said tomorrow, but for some reason that popped into my head. That's what I do as an autistic. I have these arbitrary thoughts that come into my head and I verbalize them. Then I think, why did I just say that? That's an example of one of the cognitive issues that autistics face. We often say things without thoroughly processing them. Anyway, I don't know whether you're an autistic or not. I know that a lot of us on the true left, the far left, are autistics. A lot of us. And I think a lot of it is because we've experienced suffering. We've experienced isolation. And we generally have or genuinely have a very strong sense of justice. Very common for autistics. to really care about social justice. And I don't mean it in the progressive way, being a social justice warrior, which is like separating the fight for social justice from revolution. That's the problem with being a social justice warrior. But linking fights for social justice to revolutionary activity, or seeing those fights in the context of one's own revolutionary activity. So, Anarcho Syndical boy, I hope we get the chance to chat verbally. Chatting in words is okay, but I prefer to avoid that when I can. I always want to talk with people over the phone or over Zoom. That's always my preference. A lot of people don't seem to share my preference, but that's my preference. I always and I'll warn you, I am a long conversationalist. So if you want me to shut up, say Mark, shut up, and I'll shut up. Well, you don't have to say shut up. Say we've been on the phone long enough. But if you say shut up, I'll remember. I said I told you to tell me shut up, and it won't bother me. So you say whatever you want, but or say shut up laughing or something. But please consider what I said. Whether maybe I'm wrong, maybe some things I said were wrong, some things I said were right. How do I know? But at least think about it. And I hope that what I said will be somewhat helpful. But remember that the people you are criticizing are people who are very, very different from yourself. And so the chances of misunderstandings developed are doubled because you are not a Marxist, you're an anarchist, you're not a communist or a socialist. I don't know whether you would call yourself one of those things. You are a syndicalist. As far as I know, none of the people you criticized were syndicalists. Realize that. Realize that you're talking with people with very different views than your own. So the fact that people may say something that may seem incorrect to you does not mean that they are ill-intentioned. I think it's always best to assume that anyone you are talking to is well-intentioned unless one has a reason to believe otherwise. Sometimes there are reasons like that. But I think usually, if you start out with that kind of positive intention, things will work out a lot better. For the time being, this is Mark by Mark A. Foster, Ph.D. Have a pleasant day and an even better day tomorrow.